We are back for another weekend. Round 11 in Austria, one of my favorite weekends of the year. We've got beautiful scenery, probably second in my book behind Monaco, but it's a track with a rich history in this sport, with the first F1 race being held here in 1963. And it's a fun circuit that gives us a lot of opportunities for action during the race. Of course, last year we saw the peak of the Max Verstappen-Lando Norris battle. I think our chances of getting a repeat this year are probably pretty low, but there are a lot of unknowns heading into this weekend with the top four teams. This is typically a strong track for McLaren and Red Bull, which makes you think that should probably continue this weekend, but could we get Mercedes back at the top after their strong performance in Montreal? And could some Ferrari upgrades bring them back into play too? Let's start with an overview of the track and this weekend. This is one of the shortest tracks on the circuit, which should bunch up the order both in qualifying and the race. The lap record here belongs to Carlos Sainz with a 1:05.619 back in 2020. So you get a lap in very quickly here. Austria has always been a favorite for Max Verstappen, though, and he holds the most wins at this track with 4. For this weekend, though, weather-wise, it looks like it'll be hot and sunny. As of now, we don't have any rain in the forecast, but at the same time, you never know being up in the mountains where this track is. But because of the high temps and the high-speed sections, I'm expecting tire degradation to be a huge factor, and it should push teams into a two-stop strategy. There's also a 38% chance of a safety car historically here, and only a 50% chance of a VSC, so not a high probability of that happening this weekend, but you never know, it could. Like I was saying a second ago, though, this is a really fun track, and we should expect a lot of overtakes, even if we don't get any excitement with weather or a safety car. Once the race gets going and DRS kicks in, there's a lot of opportunity for overtakes in the first part of the track. Turn 3, most common spot, coming out of that long straight at the end of Sector 1, but sometimes you see drivers pull back on the overtake until Turn 4 because you get that last DRS zone after that, and it becomes a lot more difficult to pass with a string of high and medium speed corners the rest of the track. There's also a chance going into Turn 1, but usually a move here compromises you with the second and third DRS zones, so it's just not worth it to make a move there. You really need a very balanced setup here, though. Turns 1, 3, and 4 are low-speed corners. Turns 5 through 8 are on the high-speed side coming down the mountain. And then we get some medium-speed corners in turns 9 and 10. So this isn't the typical race where you go, oh, okay, it's a high-speed circuit like Jeddah, so it favors this team more. Or it's a low-speed circuit like Monaco, so it favors that team more. It's all about who has the most balance with their package, which probably gives the edge to McLaren. But after the dip we saw in Canada, you can't be so certain there. Let's go through the top 4 teams, though. If I had to pick, I think McLaren's still the favorite this weekend. They've just had the most balanced race car this year, and I think that gives them the edge this weekend. But on top of that, it's going to be hot. Tire degradation is going to be a factor, and I think that'll be the biggest factor that separates McLaren from the rest of the grid in this race on Sunday. I can't wait to see how Lando looks after the crash with Oscar in Canada, though. We keep saying it, but this is another huge weekend for him. He started the season on a really high note with a win in Australia. Then we started to see the mishaps and the mental errors, with the lowest point, of course, being Saudi Arabia with the Q3 crash. But then after Monaco, it looked like he was back on top of things and looking like the Lando of old again. And then we have the crash in Canada that set everything back. Can Lando bounce back again? Or is this something that's going to continue to spiral? I think he at least gets back on top of things this weekend. Lando's always been strong in Austria, and he's got the car underneath him to put it together. Does that mean he beats Oscar? Maybe, maybe not, but he should be somewhere at the top and likely back on the podium on Sunday. You can't count out Max Verstappen, though, especially here. Outside of a retirement in 2020 and the P5 last year, Max has either won this race or finished second every year since 2018. And last year would have been another top 2 finish without that crash with Lando. Max knows this track inside and out, and I think he's in the mix with the McLarens for a win on Sunday. There have been some reports since Canada that teams are estimating that McLaren lost around a 10th with the technical directive change, and it seems accurate based on what we've seen, but I think that, along with Red Bull's Imola upgrades, brought Red Bull back into the picture, at least Max back into the picture. If Max can come out of qualifying, or at least P2, or pole, he could really put himself in a great position to control this race. And we all know how spectacular Max can be in qualifying. Unfortunately for Red Bull, though, I don't think Max is getting any help on the other side of his garage with Yuki. Since Yuki was promoted to Red Bull after China, Yuki's race results have been P12, P9, a DNF, P10, P10, P17, P13, and P12. That's not going to cut it with Red Bull. He's barely finishing in the points, and even when he's in the points, there's at least one midfield driver finishing ahead of him. Now, we all know this is a very difficult car to drive, but Yuki desperately needs a top 5, or at least a top 7, 8 finish this weekend. I just don't know if I like those chances of that happening. Does Mercedes keep the hot streak going, or is it a fall from grace for them this weekend? I think it's probably a fall from grace, and it's because of the heat. Mercedes has improved in this area. We saw a little bit of that in Canada. It was warm enough where they thought it would be a problem, and it wasn't, which was a good sign for them. But it wasn't as hot in Canada as it will be this weekend. And I think they drop off a little bit because of that, but not as much as we saw early in the season. This also just hasn't really been Mercedes' strongest track. Sure, George won last year, but without that Max Lando incident, he's finishing P3, 15, 16 seconds off the lead. And since the regulation change in 2022, Mercedes is usually finishing pretty far off the pace, off the leaders, like that's that type of gap. I still think it'll be a top 5 finish, but just not the double podium finish we saw in Canada from them. All eyes will be on Ferrari this weekend. They're bringing a new floor, which will be followed by a new rear suspension in Silverstone or Spa. But after that, it looks like the focus completely shifts to the 2026 car. So it's make it or break it time for them. The hope is that this solves the right height problems that have plagued them this year. And for those who have missed this with Ferrari, the old floor didn't allow them to run the car as low as they needed to, which compromised a lot with the car's performance. If this new floor works as expected, it should widen the operating window and should help with tire management, qualifying pace, and just the car's overall consistency. The biggest area to gain has to be with qualifying, though. Ferrari has consistently been put on their back foot with poor qualifying performances for both Charles and Lewis, but they've still shown a decent race pace. And if they just qualified better, the race results would be much better. This upgrade sounds and looks good on paper, but unfortunately there doesn't seem to be a lot of optimism around the upgrades. Lewis came out and said he isn't expecting much to change. Now, of course, Lewis can be pretty pessimistic at times, especially in situations like this. But I don't know if I'm expecting much to change either. Will it close the gap to the front? Yeah, probably a little bit. But will it bring them close enough where they can actually compete for race wins? Probably not. They just haven't been anywhere close this year, and I think the gap's too big for them to close with this one upgrade. But on top of that too, this is just one part of the upgrade. Will this new floor show improvement on its own? Or do we need to wait for the new rear suspension to really see the car's new potential? But other teams are bringing upgrades too. It's not just Ferrari. And as long as those upgrades are working for the other teams, it gets harder and harder for Ferrari to close the gap. Some thoughts on the midfield teams for this weekend. I'm not the most optimistic about Williams. This track should suit their car better than what we saw in Canada. But the bad news is James Vowles came out and admitted that they still haven't fixed their brake cooling issues. And there's a very good chance that continues this weekend with the hot temperatures. And the teams that have been behind them are closing the gap with upgrades. Well, Williams has kind of closed up shop on their development for this year. So it's only going to get more difficult for Williams to keep these performances in line the more the season goes on. I'm expecting Racing Bulls, to have a bounce back weekend. Austria is usually a better track for them, but then you consider how much they've taken from Red Bull to build this car. On top of how good they've already looked this year, it should be a good weekend for them, and they should come out of it with some points. Can the hot streak continue for Sauber? I think so. They're bringing a new floor this weekend, so they need that to work in their favor, but they've looked so good since the technical directive change, and I think that continues. I don't know if it means points, but I think they'll at least be close. And that's a lot better than the expectations we had for them at the beginning of the season. I'd watch out for Haas sneaking into the points on Sunday. This track suits their car very well. They've had double points finishes 2 out of the last 3 races here, and Ollie Behrman won the F2 race last year. Everything is pointing in the right direction for them heading into this weekend. There's a good chance they come out of it with some points. It's probably going to be a tough weekend for Alpine. They've been losing so much speed in straight line compared to the other teams, and that's going to be exaggerated here. That's not good news for Franco Colapinto. He needs some good race results if he wants to stick around, and that looks like it'll be an uphill battle this weekend. Aston Martin, 2 straight points finishes for Fernando Alonso. Can he make it 3 in a row? He's got a shot, but the competition for those final points finishes is going to be tough. But it looks like the technical directive change, with the help of some upgrades, might have turned things around for this team. And Fernando has been getting everything out of this car lately. Not expecting a lot out of his teammate Lance Stroll. He should be better off than he was in Canada with 2 more weeks of recovery from that wrist procedure. But he's finished 15th or lower in every race since China. Going to Sunday, some podium predictions. P3, I've got Max Verstappen. P2, Lando Norris. And P1, Oscar Piastri. I just like the McLaren's chances this weekend. And I like Oscar's chances to keep this run going. I think for Lando, it's probably going to hurt him a little bit not getting any track time in FP1, especially coming after the Canada crash. But it comes down to qualifying between these two. We know that. And Oscar's just had the edge. And just with the pressure, the small margins around this track, how fast it is, I just like Oscar coming out on top. I like Max to be fast, but I think he might be kind of caught in no man's land, just not fast enough to keep up with the McLarens, but too fast for Ferrari and Mercedes. That car's a lot stronger, but I do think they're going to struggle with their tires more than they want to this weekend with the hot temperatures. After that, I like a mix of the Ferraris and Mercedes. My best guess, give me Charles Leclerc P4, George Russell P5, Kimi Antonelli P6, and Lewis Hamilton P7. After that, I think it gets really tight between the midfield teams. I don't know the order. I like Isaac Hadjar P8. I like one of the Haas's, probably P9 or P10. Give me Fernando in that last point spot, whether it's P9 or P10. But, like I said, very tight in that part of the grid. You never know what can happen there. All right, I want to finish up with some off-the-track news that we got this week. Max Verstappen to Mercedes. Could that actually happen? We always get rumors of these types of moves happening, and it's always hard to figure out, okay, what's true, what's credible, what has weight, what doesn't. This one is starting to have a little bit of weight, and that's because of some comments that George Russell made this weekend, or going into this week, basically saying, he was asked what the holdup is for him not signing a new contract with Mercedes, and he flat out said, you gotta ask my boss. I'm really over here waiting, for that paperwork to come my way to sign, but Toto hasn't come over. And on top of that, George basically admitted that there have been conversations between Max Verstappen and Mercedes, and he's been very honest about that in the past, that, look, I understand Max is the best driver on the grid. Any team would want to have him. But at the same time, George is pretty confident in his standing with the team too. He's won that last race in Canada. Before that, he's had very consistent results, a lot of podiums this year. He's been getting everything out of that Mercedes car, and he's been a very good mentor for Kimi Antonelli as well. But as good as George has been, if Mercedes has the opportunity to sign Max Verstappen, they're going to take it. And when you really think about it from Max's perspective, is Mercedes his best bet for 2026 and moving forward? The reports have been all over the place. Very known. Mercedes has the best power unit heading into the new regulations as of now. Max sees that. That's no secret for him. And it's also no secret that Max doesn't really want to spend a whole lot of time in F1. He wants to spend time with his family. He wants to go to other racing series. He wants to do stuff outside of the sport. He's not going to be here forever. And right now, his current deal runs to 2028. So you expect, okay, there's a good chance after 2028 he's gone, which you also think, okay, does that contract pose any type of threat of stopping him from making a move like this to Mercedes? Look, I'm sure there are clauses in there that Max can use to his advantage, and I'm sure at the end of the day, Max can probably do whatever he wants to do. And if he has to leave the team and sit out of the sport to get his way, maybe he does that. But for just his overall prospects, looking at, okay, do I want to stay with Red Bull? Do I want to go to Mercedes? There's a good chance he wants to go to Mercedes. And it's pretty obvious, too. He's got a good relationship forming with Kimi Antonelli. They're very friendly with each other, very complimentary to each other, too. And I think there's a lot of respect between those two drivers. It would be just an ugly move to see from George's perspective. And he really hasn't done anything wrong. He came into this team, faced up against Lewis Hamilton, one of the greatest drivers in this sport, and he held his own. And at the end of those 3 years, I think, they came out, 61 and 61 or something with their head-to-head. They were extremely close. George completely held his own against Lewis. And now he has this new phenom coming in as a teammate in Kimi Antonelli. And as good as Kimi has looked, George has looked better almost every single time on track. So there's no fault on George. It's just the reality of this situation. If Mercedes can get Max Verstappen, they're going to get Max Verstappen. And if Max Verstappen wants to leave Red Bull to go to Mercedes, he's probably going to make that happen too. Looks like we're going to get some new news from Cadillac in the next couple weeks about a driver announcement. We got a cryptic Instagram, or I think it was Instagram post from Valtteri Bottas, basically walking up to a Cadillac saying, "Oh, look, open seat." And, just a lot of cryptic statements in there that made you think, all right, is this going to happen? It makes sense for Cadillac. And I thought going into this, my best guess was they're going to take an older driver like a Valtteri Bottas, like a Sergio Perez, put him in one seat, put a younger driver in the second seat. Now it's looking like it could be two veteran drivers in both of those seats. And it looks like it could be Bottas in one, Perez in the other. And the more I think about it, that's not the worst idea for Cadillac. I mean, look, as exciting as it is for a new team to come into the sport, there's a very, very high chance they're not going to be good. And it's going to take years for them to even think about being good. So does it really make sense to bring a young driver in there who's going to struggle, knowing the team's already probably going to struggle with their car to begin with? Or does it make more sense to bring two veteran drivers with a lot of endorsement deals into the team and just capitalize on the sponsorships and the money you can make in those first few years in the sport while you figure out the rest, while you get the infrastructure in place, and while you build that car into a competitive car? The more you think about it, the more that seems like the more likely situation. So my best guess is it's probably going to be Valtteri Bottas and Sergio Perez, but watch out for Zhou Guanyu. He's another one that comes. Of course, he doesn't have the experience that both of these drivers have, but he's got the sponsorships with China. So another name to watch out for. But if I was one of those younger drivers hoping for a Cadillac seat, I'd be feeling a little pessimistic right now. All right, that's a wrap on today's episode previewing the Austrian Grand Prix. I will be going live a couple times this weekend on TikTok, both for qualifying and the race. So look up the Chicanery Podcast on TikTok. Tune into those if you want to, but just doing some live streams, live reactions to both qualifying and the race on Sunday. I will, of course, be back with another episode on Sunday, recapping the Grand Prix and everything else we saw this weekend. And I'm feeling pretty optimistic about this weekend. I don't know if we're going to get chaos with a safety car or anything absurd there, but I think we're going to get a lot of on-track action with a lot of overtakes. But at the end of the day, we should have some beautiful scenery to watch on TV at least. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and listening. Till next time.